Today's show is all about the Walt Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles, California. This stainless steel structure has been part of the downtown LA skyline for almost 20 years now. It's an unmistakable structure that exists due to a generous gift by Lillian Disney in honor of her husband, Walt. But Walt's ties to the Music Center in Los Angeles began long before there was a concert hall named after him. Hear all about Walt's history with the Music Center, as well as how other Disney family members got involved in the Walt Disney Concert Hall, from Howard Sherman, the Music Center's Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer. Plus, Howard shares insight about the design of the building, the gardens surrounding it, the acoustically perfect concert hall, and so much more. That's all coming your way right now.
It's time to dive into today's Disney dialogue.
Hello, Howard, and welcome to Disney Coast to Coast. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm actually thrilled and excited to be here.
Yay, I'm excited too, because we're going to be talking about the Walt Disney Concert Hall, which, some Disney fans who live in other parts of the country may not even know about. I got to say, as somebody who's lived in Los Angeles for a long time, the Walt Disney Concert Hall is extremely recognizable. You cannot miss it. Once you see it, you will never unsee it. And I don't know a ton about its history, and I always, even though I've taken the tour, I love the tours that are available. But I wanted to kind of share all of that knowledge with the listeners who maybe don't live here, might visit someday, and want to know more about it. So,
sure.
Yeah, you're the Executive Vice President and the Chief Operating Officer of the Music Center, and the Walt Disney Concert Hall is part of that. So let's just kind of start with the basics of how and why does this venue even exist?
Sure. And at some point, let's also talk about the rich connection of the Disney's family and Walt Disney himself to the Music Center. So it came out of years of a relationship. But to the specific of this hall, in the late 80s, my goodness, it was a long time ago, the need for a fourth venue at the Music Center was clear. The Dorothy Chandler Pavilion, which is our largest venue, was home to the LA Opera, the LA Philharmonic, and the LA Master Chorale. And it left very little time for anything else. In fact, it was one of the busiest halls in the world. And the challenge is when you build a hall that does something for everybody, it's not always perfect for anybody. And it's a beautiful building, and the acoustics are incredible for opera and for sung voice. But the LA Phil always felt a little lost on the stage, even though it was built for them. 50 years later, 40 years later, they wanted a new home. And LA had grown. And the reality was a dedicated concert hall just made sense. So there was talk of it, of how do we build a fourth theater? What do we want the fourth theater to be? And then came Lillian Disney. Walt was obviously gone, and Mrs. Disney made an incredibly generous $50 million gift, and it was a cash gift, meaning it was accruing interest from the minute it was made, which is rare in philanthropy. Gifts of that size are generally done over time, and they're pledges. This was a cash gift to build a concert hall in honor of her husband, the late Walt Disney. She had a few things she wanted. She wanted the hall to be acoustically perfect, and she wanted it to reflect her love of gardens. Those are sort of the things she said. So an international design competition was done. People came from all over the world. I don't remember how many commissions there were for the competition, but about 6, I believe. And a committee was put together to judge and whatnot. And then we like to say Frank Gehry is, our homegrown local boy. He's actually Canadian, but he's lived in LA for most of his life and career. So we've claimed him as our own. Frank won the competition. And then things started happening. It had a sort of long and storied history from gift to design competition to opening, but we can get into all of that. But it really boils down to the need for a dedicated concert hall as a fourth theater for the Music Center.
Because the LA Phil at that time was using the Hollywood Bowl for the summer, but then sharing the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion in the colder months.
Exactly. Their winter season from September to May was in the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion.
All right.
So, yeah.
So late 80s donation to opening on October 24th, 2003. By the way, happy 20th anniversary very, very soon.
Thank you. It is so hard to believe. It's crazy. It feels like it was yesterday.
But I mean, that's a lot of time. Late 80s to 2003. We're talking about,
Yeah, it was like 16 years, I think, from the when the gift was sealed to when the building opened, is
yeah.
what I think it was.
So a lot happened. You mentioned the competition. Now, Lillian Disney, she was alive when she made the donation?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
Was
Yeah,
she alive for the opening?
she was not.
Okay. How far into the process did she see this get?
No. She saw it get pretty far. The great story there is when the designs started coming out and when Frank won the competition and the first design, by the way, looked not really quite like the building ended up being. Designs are a
Frank's first
process.
design?
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. It was very different. Had a bridge across First Street. It had this sort of atrium in front. But Mrs. Disney looked at it and said, supposedly, and although I believe it's true, that she always pictured a little brown church. She pictured a simple little building. And when Frank's design, which is, not simple and it's spectacular, and as you said, once you see it, you know it, she sort of stepped aside and let her daughters, and Sharon was still alive at that point, as was Diane. Sharon passed relatively quickly after that. I'm pretty sure Sharon predeceased Lillian. And so it was the daughters and then ultimately Diane Disney Miller who really held the family's interest in the project. So Mrs. Disney stepped aside pretty early.
So, we've talked a bit about the way that it looks. And for anybody who hasn't seen it, can you kind of describe it a little bit?
Wow, sure. It's a spectacular stainless steel structure that sort of rises out of the ground at the corner of First and Grand in downtown Los Angeles. People have said it looks like sails, it looks like a ship. People have said it looks like pieces of sheet music floating in the air. It's an imposing and spectacular structure that is clad in stainless steel. The original design, well, the very original design, I believe, was limestone, although I'm not sure how limestone curves, so I don't know how that would have worked. Then it was titanium. And if you know any of other Frank Gehry's work, the Bilbao Museum Guggenheim in Spain was actually designed after the concert hall, but it was built before, and it's very similar. It's definitely Frank's sort of stainless steel titanium period. And the technology that was used to build Bilbao was then advanced and developed and allowed us to build the concert hall. It is surprisingly airy on the inside. There are skylights everywhere. There is natural light pouring in everywhere. Yet when you approach it, it's almost this imposing structure that you don't realize is going to have the life inside it that it really does.
So it's interesting because this was definitely something that exists because of that gift from the Disney family. But at the same time, this was already a problem looking to be solved by the city of Los Angeles and the LA Phil. Correct? So how did those two minds meet? Was she did somebody ask her, hey, we're looking to do this? Would you like to make a donation? Or
interesting question, and it's actually the county of Los Angeles. The Music Center is owned by the county, and so I work for a private not-for-profit, the Music Center, but we program and manage the county's facility. And as I said, there was a long, rich history with the Disney family, which we can certainly talk about because it's really very cool, actually, Walt Disney's involvement early on with Dorothy Chandler. But as the Music Center, as the county, as the LA Phil realized this need was there, the story goes, and I can't verify this, that just about that time, the Disney company wanted to do the Disney stores. And there was some agreement that needed to be made with the family because technically Walt Disney Company couldn't do retail, couldn't use the words Walt Disney in that way. So my understanding is the deal, which was really de minimis because nobody thought the Disney stores would take off like they did, produced an incredible amount of money for Lillian and for the family pretty quickly. And Mrs. Disney wanted to do something to honor her husband and his love of orchestral music and the LA Phil. And as often the case with gifts of that scale, it's all about the timing. You have somebody whose interest and resources allow to further something, and there's a need. And in this case, it was just a perfect marriage of those two things. I will also say when her gift came through, the sort of naivete at the time was, well, it's a $50 million cash gift. This will pay for an incredible concert hall in 1986 dollars. Yeah, you laugh. That's correct. You should laugh. Um, it came nowhere near, as you can imagine. The county, in its incredible largesse, also built the garage under it. And so the county operates the garage as it does at the Music Center garage. And then the Music Center raised the money to build the building on top of it. It took so many years, in answer to actually your question of a few minutes ago, not only because of the design competition, but we had the civil unrest in Los Angeles. We had the economic downturn in downtown Los Angeles, and everything came to a screeching halt. No one actually believed this project could continue. Well, that's not true. The Music Center always knew. I think the Disney family always knew. But there was much skepticism that could Los Angeles at that moment support this building, support it. And three people sort of came forward. Eli Broad, who passed away recently, the philanthropist, Richard Reardon, who was mayor at the time, and Andrea Vandekamp, who was chairman of the board of the Music Center. And those three people together realized the need for civic pride, the need for the Music Center to have this success, the need for the LA Phil to have its home, and started the fundraising up again. And there was an additional $274 million raised to actually get the building built. And that's on top of the Disney gifts and the interest and the time it took to develop it. So it was an incredible philanthropic feat to raise the money to build this building. And it got done.
And you mentioned that Lillian really did this in honor of her husband, Walt Disney, but did it
Yes.
always have the name, the Walt Disney Concert Hall, or was it going to be maybe just the Disney Concert Hall? Like,
I love that you asked that question because I know how passionate you are about Walt Disney World. And
yes.
I would say we are equally as passionate about its Walt Disney Concert Hall. It was always Walt Disney Concert Hall. It's in honor of the man. There's a bit of a mixed blessing because people see the words Walt Disney and assume it's the corporation, or think, why are you raising money for something Disney is doing? And it is not. It is Music Center is a not-for-profit organization that raised the money in his honor. The other thing, the Disney family was so special, and we should talk a little bit about Diane and Ron, and when we get there. But the way the words Walt Disney Concert Hall are in the building, did you even notice when you've toured it?
Well,
Can you even tell me where it was?
there's it's like dots in the wall. So it's not
Correct.
like they don't protrude out, they actually sink
That's right.
in. And I think on the exterior, even if you're looking at it from a side angle, you don't see it. If you're looking at it
That's
straight
right.
on, you kind of see it. And I think at night it's backlit. Is that correct?
Yes, you're exactly right. It's perforated into the stainless steel on the grand stairs. So if you enter a different way, you don't see it. If you're coming from a different angle, you don't see it. And it is so indicative to me of the Disney family. They could have had, neon lights. They made this building happen. It could have been whatever Mrs. Disney, Diane Disney Miller wanted it to be, and they wanted the subtlety. They appreciated the artistry of Frank Gehry. They understood it needed to blend in, and were totally comfortable and supportive of that being the marker of the building. And I just think that speaks volumes to their civic pride, to their philanthropy, to why they did this. It was not about putting the words Walt Disney in neon. It was about a gift to honor the man. And it's really cool.
Now, a lot of the people that we've talked about today who were involved with, starting this fundraiser, donating the money and being involved with the design and stuff have sadly passed on. Is the Disney family at all involved anymore, and or the Walt Disney Company?
Not so much. At this moment in time, we actually don't have a Disney on the Music Center board. I'm not sure if Tim is still on the Philharmonics board. Diane and Ron were really the stewards of that relationship.
So Diane, Walt's daughter, and then
Correct.
Ron, Walt's son-in-law. Yep.
Correct. Yeah. And thank you. The studio is still involved only in that we do events occasionally. We've done movie premieres. We've done Walt Disney Company employee awards, luncheons, and whatnot. But no, not in a deep way, really. We work on the six families, we like to say, the Disney family, the Chandler family, the Taper family, the Amundsen family, the Moss family, and Gloria Molina's family because of the park. Those are sort of our six, familias. And so we keep them very close and we honor the gifts they've made and the buildings they've allowed us to build.
Yeah, so let's zoom out a little bit for a second. Since you just mentioned all those different families, a lot of them are about different venues. People who don't live in LA don't know this. And actually, I want you to clarify one thing for me. What's the difference between the Music Center and Center Theater Group?
Oh, sure. Center Theater Group is one of our tenants. So the Music Center is the company, it's the company and the facility. So it is the four theaters, Jerry Moss Plaza, and Gloria Molina Grand Park. And at the Music Center, we have incredible partners that produce and present the bulk of the work. And in Walt Disney Concert Hall, it's the LA Philharmonic and the LA Master Chorale. In the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion, it's the LA Opera, as well as our own dance program and our community engagement work. And then in the Taper and the Amundsen, it's almost exclusively Center Theater Group who program and present in those buildings.
All
That
right.
help?
Yes, absolutely. And anybody who doesn't live here, these are all basically next to each other, walking distance. Kind of, there's a plaza in between them. It's a beautiful area of downtown LA.
Yeah.
You mentioned, it sounds like you have some stories about Diane and Ron's involvement, because it sounds like they were the kind of the latest Disney family members to be involved, closest to its completion, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I knew her better than I knew him. They're both sadly gone now. She was the most unassuming, you would never know, and she went by Diane Miller. And so you would have no way to know who this was necessarily. And there's two things that come to mind. After the building stalled, so, the Disney gift came forward, the garage was built, then it was clear we needed to raise, hundreds of millions of more dollars. The city was in the economic downturn, the riots had happened. It was really a bleak moment. And there were a number of brainstormy moments as to how to get the building back on track. And somebody actually suggested in a meeting, and I wasn't at that meeting, but Diane told me the story, and I get chills when I tell it still. Somebody in a meeting said, you know what? We have Frank Gehry's designs. Why don't we just take Frank off the project and get this done quickly and cheaply? Because we know, the brilliance of a Frank Gehry will cost us time and money. And Diane looked at the room and said, if you take Frank off the project, you take my father's name off the building. If I learned nothing from him, I learned that it's about the artist. And I still get chills. And so She was right. We have a fully realized Frank Gehry masterpiece. And it's brilliant. And it's because of Diane's leadership and her recognition of the artist, because of the house she grew up in, that allowed this to happen. And I will forever give her credit for letting that building be what it is.
One of the things that I find so interesting about this is obviously this huge donation was made by the Disney family because of Walt's love of the LA Phil and just appreciation of art in general, which, on one hand doesn't sound surprising, but on the other hand, I feel like might surprise a lot of people because, even to this day, I feel like people still think of Walt Disney as this guy who made children's entertainment. But, he used classical music in a lot of his projects. I know he was a season ticket holder for the Hollywood Bowl, and he had such an appreciation for the arts. And I think that's, we think of him still as this small town guy.
Right.
But he really, he was one of the most influential people in Hollywood, but also had a great, great, great appreciation of the fine arts.
I think he also understood the role in which he played and the responsibility he had, given his celebrity, to make Los Angeles a great city. And he was very aware of what it needed and how he could use his celebrity, to use that word again, for good. And he did. When the building was first being built, there's two great stories about Walt Disney in the early years. And the first one is in the mid 50s, the Hollywood Bowl went bankrupt. And it was a disaster, and it was a very difficult time. And Dorothy Chandler came forward to save it. And it was her first big philanthropic effort, and it was for her beloved LA Philharmonic, and she couldn't let the embarrassment of the bowl dying be what marked Los Angeles. And she raised money, And Walt Disney helped her. Walt Disney helped her by calling in his friends and by doing a concert at the Bowl of Disney music. But what sticks out most is the Music Center had an extensive archive of a lot of things that we just about 3 years ago donated to UCLA with the Chandler Family Archives. It needs to be for the public good. It shouldn't be sitting at the Music Center in archival warehouses. But the one piece that I hated giving up was there was a thank you book from everybody that Mrs. Chandler, all of her fans, when she saved the bowl in 1955. And in the middle of it was a double truck page. And on the right hand side was sort of a skewed at almost a 45-degree angle, a typewritten note, dear Buff, thank you so much. The LA thanks you, the world, blah, 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 signed Walt. And on the left side, he or one of his artists had drawn a number of Disney characters right in the book. And Mickey Mouse reached across from the left to the right, and his paw was holding the paper, and the paper had a cutout in the shape of the paw. And it was just, it was this brilliant artifact from Walt Disney to Dorothy Chandler from the mid 50s. And it was so cool. And UCLA owns it now, which they should. It's part of our archives.
That's
So,
amazing. So we've heard the name Dorothy Chandler a few times, and the building closest to the Walt Disney Concert Hall is the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion. Now, you
yes,
mentioned that Dorothy Chandler helped save the Hollywood Bowl. Would that have been before or after her pavilion existed?
it was before. It was the mid 50s, and she realized that she had this ability to fundraise. And she too wanted to put Los Angeles on the map. And in the early 60s, the LA County was building the LA County Museum of Art. A number of museums were coming to be, and Mrs. Chandler wanted a performing arts center. She got her friends to help raise money. She raised $20 million, which in the 60s was incredible. But in the end, she wanted to bring it to the people. She wanted the people of Los Angeles to feel like they really were vested and owned its performing arts center. So she went to her friend Walt Disney and asked Walt for help. He designed, or somebody at the studio designed, what are called buck bags. And they were these blue shopping bags that Mrs. Disney's friends would stand outside of grocery stores all across the city of Los Angeles saying, give a buck for the music center, give a buck for the music center. And it was Walt Disney that made that happen. And it raised over $1 million, which was a huge amount of money. But what it really did was get the city invested in this idea. And had it not been for Walt Disney and their relationship and his ability to create this for her, it wouldn't have happened. So he was here from the very beginning, which I just think is so cool.
My guess is this is just a bit of coincidence, but was like that taken into consideration at all when it came into the placement of the Walt Disney Concert Hall? Because it is interesting how those two buildings are now literally across the street from each other.
It was in that lot that it sits on was always part of the music center. It was parking.
Okay.
And so when the
Oh,
music
okay.
center expanded to a fourth theater, it used the county land that it already had. So it really was part of the facility. There was a lot of debates. Do we put it over the street? Do we enlarge the plaza? And it didn't make sense for a number of reasons. And really where it needed to end up is where it did, across the street.
That's so cool. And I will say that, I've taken the tours when you go into the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion and you look at the names on the
Yeah.
wall as you enter of the people who have, helped make it possible. There you will see Mr. and Mrs. Disney right on the wall.
Yeah.
So, one of the first donors, I believe, right?
They were very early founders. They were not only friends with Mrs. Chandler, but they were friends with Welton Beckett.
I'm going to be super naive for a second. What was Mrs. Chandler famous for, or why was she so wealthy?
So her husband, Norman Chandler, owned, and the Chandler family owned the LA Times.
Ah, that
So
explains
they
it. Okay.
were, yeah, exactly. They ran the newspaper. They probably elected Richard Nixon. They very Republican at the day, used the power of the press. And Mrs. Chandler, her family, her maiden name was Buffum. And Buffum's department store was a lovely high-end department store in Southern California. But the Chandler family really felt Norman married beneath him because he married a common retailer. a newspaper man should not marry somebody who sells, clothing and goods. And they sort of ostracized her. And she, took her social standing and sort of created a whole new neighborhood, the Hancock Park neighborhood in Los Angeles. She put that on the map by moving there and letting polite society move there. And she was determined to make her mark. And she did, which is why she got involved with the Hollywood Bowl and the LA Phil and building her music center. And she was a force to be reckoned with. In her fundraising prowess, the story is if she believed you could do better, she would literally rip your check in half and give it back to you and say, "Oh no,
Wow.
you can give more." Yeah, exactly. So she was a force. And Welton Beckett was a very well-known mid-century architect in Los Angeles. He did the Capitol Records building, which is famous worldwide, the round building. He worked on LAX, the LA airport, sort of gooky old dome in the middle, and he worked on Tomorrowland. He
Oh,
worked
wow.
on the early drawings when Walt was still putting together ideas for his amusement park. So he and Welton Beckett went way back, and Mrs. Chandler and Walt Disney went way back. So it made sense that they were amongst the first donors. After the building opened, Mrs. Chandler realized she needed to keep fundraising, and she created an amazing organization that exists to this day called the Blue Ribbon. And Lillian Disney, Mrs. Disney, was one of the first Blue Ribbon members. So they supported, up until the very end, they supported this place constantly. It was a long, close relationship, it's really interesting.
That really is super interesting. It's wild the ties that I mean, first of all, the people Walt Disney knew,
Yes.
incredible. Like
Yeah.
he had no surprise, but the man had connections. Like there's
Yeah. He
no
was Walt
question.
Disney,
He was Walt Disney, exactly. It's incredible. Earlier on, you said one of the things that was important to Lillian Disney when she made the donation was to have, I believe it was gardens. You said.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
I know that there are, gardens and sculptures around the exterior of the Walt Disney Concert Hall. I want to
Mhm.
talk a bit about those, and I believe there's a certain rose fountain as well that has specific meaning.
So there is a really pretty monumental garden on one side of Walt Disney Concert Hall. And it's interestingly enough, it is 3 stories above street level. And architecturally, it is above all of the practice and rehearsal rooms. So, think about that. You've got a garden with trees and plants that need water over all of your rehearsal rooms. So, when the building was built, the state of California actually contributed and it became a state park. It's the smallest state park in the state of California. Um, and the building was designed such that the building was sealed. Then the planters were put on top of it, and then the planters were filled with water for about 6 months to ensure the integrity of them. And then finally, the landscape architect had gone around the city and literally bought full grown trees off of people's property and they craned them in. The idea being Mrs. Disney wanted a full blooming, beautiful garden, and that can take years to grow unless you just buy ones that have already grown and put them there, which is actually what the team did. When she passed, which was before the building opened, sadly, her kids and grandkids wanted to tribute her somehow. And apparently she collected Delft china, which is it's a very, very old, it's been around for, hundreds and hundreds of years. And it's a decal china and it's sort of a blue and white, very traditional pattern. And the family thought, wouldn't it be lovely to create a garden sculpture of a flower using Delft china? And so they created a piece. They brought in artisans, and it's called A Rose for Lily. And it was built on site, and it is a beautiful Zen sort of a symbolic rose. You realize it's a flower as you approach it, but it's very sort of abstract in its shape. And it was designed on site. It was built on site. The story goes there's 2 stories. Either they went to the Delft factory and bought seconds because they were breaking all of this china, and I assure you it was not Lillian Disney's china that was broken for this fountain. Um, or they special ordered it and over decaled because Delft china has actually more white than blue in it, and the fountain is much more blue than white. So it's kind of fun folklore. We don't know, but it is this beautiful tribute reflecting Lillian Disney's love of a rose garden, putting it in the middle of this beautiful, spectacular garden, and then using her china pattern to do the mosaic. It's very special. And set up against the sort of 3-story stainless steel wall of the concert hall, it's spectacular. And you sort of suddenly forget you are 3 stories high in the middle of downtown Los Angeles. It's very peaceful. It's lovely.
Yeah, that whole area has a really special feel to it. The whole what's the plaza called between the different venues?
Jerry Moss Plaza,
The
the
Jerry
one that,
Moss
yeah,
Plaza. Yeah.
yeah. Jerry Moss was another philanthropist from that same period. He is the M in A&M Records. So it's Herb
Mm.
Alpert and Jerry Moss. So Jerry and Walt Disney also had a relationship in the early 60s. So, and Jerry Moss sadly just passed last month.
Wow.
So it's Los Angeles royalty.
Yeah. We've been talking about the stainless steel structure coming up out of the ground, and I've heard a story. I don't know if it's true or not. Perhaps you can
Okay,
confirm or deny. But
sure.
is it true that they had to dull down the steel because it was like so blinding? It was kind of like a mirror.
It is true for a small part of it.
Okay.
There's an expression, no press is bad press and never waste a good crisis. And so the bulk of the building is dulled matte finish stainless steel. There are 2 sections of the building that were designed to be reflective. One of them is on the back of an amphitheater in the garden, actually, this beautiful the Keck Amphitheater, which doesn't have any exposure to anywhere off the property. The other was on top of the donor lounge, the founder's room. And it's this sculptural piece that Frank wanted to be reflective and shiny, just sort of to stand out as sort of the beacon, the candle on the corner of the building. It's spectacular. But what it did was cause incredible reflections on the sidewalk, on the condominiums across the street. And so something had to be done. And again, because you just, no press is bad press and own what you got to own, we brought in USC to do a study of the sun. And they literally did 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. Where is the sun hitting and which panels are the guilty reflective panels? And then we brought Frank back and his team back, and they helped design. It was a 2-step process with different sandpapers, and you sanded the first one for so many minutes, and then you dusted it, and it was this whole thing. It was literally less than 2% of the surface of the building. But we brought press out. We showed what we were doing. We were being good neighbors. We solved the problem, and I love the fact that 20 years later, that folklore still exists because we owned it and we fixed it. But what we fixed was de minimis. But boy, it has a life. I love it.
It got attention. And so that was like in its first year that happened.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. Yes. I don't remember exactly when, but it was within the year or 2 that we solved it.
Wow.
So, we kept on the front pages of the paper for a while, so it was all good.
That's so funny.
It really is.
Now, we've been talking a lot about the exterior, but let's go into the actual concert hall, into the performance space, because the acoustics are designed. Listen, you said it. It was built specifically for the LA Phil. Like, it was known musical instruments are going to be in here. I saw something there recently, and I actually went up to somebody at a soundboard during intermission. And I was like, are these folks even mic'd? Because it sounded all so natural. And he said to me, he goes, minimally. They are minimally mic'd because the acoustics in the space are just so grand and so specific to that need. And I believe you said that's something that was important to Lillian, correct?
Absolutely. If we were, and to the music center and to the LA Phil, I mean, if you're building not a multi-purpose hall like the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion, but a concert hall, its reason for being is for orchestral, choral, live music. So it better be amazing. And Dr. Toyota of Nagata Acoustics was Frank Gehry's partner from the very beginning. And interestingly enough, inside in the auditorium itself, it's a fairly traditional shape. It's a shoebox shape that orchestras have been performing in since the 18th century, 17th century. The circulation around it, the shapes around it is the brilliance of Frank Gehry that takes a very traditional, tried and true acoustical shape and embellishes it to make this stunning piece of architecture. So the room, as I say, is fairly traditional, although the seating configurations are sort of wonky in a brilliant way. There's two little areas to the far left and right of the orchestra section we call the boats, which kind of look like they're hovering into the room. There are two balconies, so it's really a fairly small, intimate space. There's seating on the sides and in back. The wood, all of the beautiful Douglas fir throughout it, Dr. Toyota called psychoacoustics. He said that's really just a finish on top of the shape that's creating the reflectivity. But if you make the room that warm and that inviting, it helps you think you are hearing even better. So it's very interesting. I will say we still have a close relationship with Nagata Acoustics because you don't want to ruin the building death by a thousand cuts. You take off one piece of glass here for a lighting instrument, and that's going to be fine. It's just one piece of glass. But eventually, over 20 years, you could potentially really do damage. And we are so respectful and careful of being stewards of this entire complex at a moment in time that we don't want to be the ones that mess it up. So Toyota's team is here pretty regularly to make sure anything we do, anything we install, is still within the acoustical parameters to keep the building so amazing, so live, so rich. I will say it terrifies some performers because when it is acoustically that perfect, it is very unforgiving. You hear every note, every detail. So if you're not at the top of your game, everyone's going to know it. So that's it's kind of fun. You have to sit up tall when you are performing in that building.
Given how acoustically perfect it is, have they recorded any albums in there or anything?
Absolutely. The LA Phil has done a number of recordings in there. We've also done quite a bit of television in there, which then becomes amplified in a different way. I want to ask or follow up on something you said about the sound guy and are they amplified? And oftentimes they'll do that for spoken word if the conductor wants to speak, or they'll do that, but never for the orchestra. What is challenging is if we're doing a pop concert, if we're doing a soloist pop singer, or that you now have to mix it, or if you're
Mm.
doing somebody that's performing with amplified music. And so the hall has to be deadened, so there are curtains that go up. There are things we do to make the sound bounce less. And we're also very particular about who we let mix in that building.
Yeah, mine was one of those live to film sort of concerts.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
So you had to
yeah,
because the conductor was going to need to hear certain things and he was going to have headphones on to be click tracking with the film. So there would have to be some amplification. So
yeah.
absolutely.
Can you talk about that organ? Because there's an organ in this space with what is the statistic? The smallest pipe is like the size of a number 2 pencil, and
Yeah.
then what's the largest one? I mean, it's
It's like
enormous.
32 feet tall. It's like from your pinky, the size of your pinky, to something that's 32 feet tall. There are, I'm going to screw up the number. I think there are 3,200 pipes.
Wow.
Um, it's huge. And behind the organ, it's 4 stories tall of pipes. And you can get into the back area and do what's called an organ crawl, where you get in to see the pipes and the reeds and how it all interconnects. And Manuel Rosales, who's the organ designer, who worked very closely with Frank on the balance between practicality and art. And there were a number of designs that went back and forth where Frank's team would say, what about this? And Manuel would say, there is no practical way to create an instrument with those shapes. So it was a good push me, pull you relationship to where they got to what's there. And Frank's office has lovingly called the pipes that you see that are over the organ, that are sort of the center back upstage imagery, he's called them the French fries, which gives us permission to call them the French fries because it does kind of look like, box of McDonald's French fries with these pipes going in all directions. It's spectacular. And the what's interesting too about the organ, it's very much, we joke in California about the Golden Gate Bridge that when you finish painting it, you start painting it over again. You're always painting the Golden Gate Bridge. The organ tuning and the organ maintenance is the same thing. There are two people whose job it is to maintain and educate people on the organ. And once they have finished tuning that last pipe, they go back to the first one that they did months and months ago. So it is a constant process of keeping the organ in tune. It's a spectacular instrument, really spectacular instrument.
Wow. It's pretty incredible. You did mention that like it's an intimate space, and I would agree. It does feel very intimate, but I believe the seating capacity is 2,265. Is that
That's
correct?
correct. Yes.
So that's not a small amount of people, yet it
No.
still accomplishes an intimate feeling, which I'm always impressed when that's accomplished.
Some of it is because of the shape and because the seats are on the sides and behind. So the traditional seats are closer to about 1,800, which is really a small auditorium. But when you enter the sides and the back, you get to the 2,265. But it's very intimate. I'll also say, no matter where you sit, the visuals and the acoustics are spectacular. The fabric of the seats, which is the same as the fabric in the carpet, and it's something Frank's team designed, and it's very floral if you sort of stand back and look at it, again reflecting Lillian Disney's love of garden. And it was designed so that the sound is the same with the hall empty or full. And that has to do with the fabric that the seats are used, the cushioning for the seats, the fabric of the seats themselves. So it is the same anywhere in that room. And that is also the brilliance of Dr. Toyota, that no matter where you are hearing the same incredible music. The Phil also had to get used to it. When you're backstage, you're in the room, and sound is transitive, and sound is everywhere. And it took them quite a while to realize you can't talk backstage because you're in the room. Similarly, the ushers, if the ushers are in any of the seating areas, you can't talk there. Unlike traditional theaters where you can get away with whispering, you can't get away with that in Walt Disney Concert Hall. Everybody's going to hear you. God forbid a cell phone goes off. Forget it.
A note to audience members as well. Anybody listening who is a future audience member in the Walt Disney Concert Hall, zip it.
Exactly.
And you know what? I want to clarify something I said a bit earlier because this might have been a little bit misleading, but I said that the LA Phil, their summer home is the Hollywood Bowl, and then winter is the Walt Disney Concert Hall. But that doesn't mean that the Walt Disney Concert Hall isn't full year round. With
Absolutely.
events.
So that's correct. Yeah, thank you for that, actually. So during the regular season, the LA Master Chorale is our other resident company in the building. So they're performing quite often. But then during the summer, we do all kinds of community groups. We do community orchestras. We do local orchestras. We do graduations. We are a building owned by the people of Los Angeles County. And it is absolutely our mission, our moral imperative to make sure that these 4 theaters are available to the taxpayers who own them. And in the summer, we do just that. And we do many, many events. This year, I was so relieved this summer. We did 4 times as many events this summer as we did last summer.
Wow.
We're still not quite back to where we were pre-COVID, where we're going every day and crazy, but just literally to quadruple, to go 4 times in 1 year felt good. It felt like the world is coming back a little bit. One of our regulars almost every summer is the Gay Men's Chorus of Los Angeles, and interestingly, their concert this summer was a tribute to Disney music. So you had the Gay Men's Chorus singing Disney music in Walt Disney Concert Hall. It was really very cool. It sort of, came home to roost. It was beautiful.
That's awesome. So, folks, if you're listening and you want to visit the Walt Disney Concert Hall, as we just said, there is entertainment there year-round. They can check out the website. What's the best website to check out for that?
The best website would be to go to the Music Center's website, musiccenter.org, and then it will direct you to everything going on here, including what's at the Walt Disney Concert Hall.
Excellent. So you can see it that way, but there are also free tours available, guided and self-guided free tours. And that info's on the website as well?
The tours are all given by the symphonians and ushers of the Music Center. So it's absolutely musiccenter.org will get you to the Walt Disney Concert Hall tours as well. They're really spectacular. I'm glad you mentioned them. They're great.
Yeah, they really are. I'd taken them a long time ago, and I took them more recently because anybody who lives in LA who has had to serve for jury duty knows that the parking structure for the Walt Disney Concert Hall is where they have you park to walk to the courthouse. And I very much lucked out. I had a very short day where they released me. And
Nice.
As I was walking back to my car, the tour was beginning. And I was like, you know what? I have some extra time I wasn't expecting. I'm going to go on this tour. And not only, did you go to the Walt Disney Concert Hall, but we went to all of the theaters. We went to the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion, the Mark Taper Forum, and the Amundsen Theater, which I don't think is always the case.
It depends on availability. It just depends on how active the theaters are. So yeah, that's great that you got into all of them. That's so
Yeah, it was
great.
pretty wild. And that was a free tour. So like highly, highly, highly recommend that to anybody who is interested. And also, I want to mention before we go, Red Cat, which stands for the Roy and Edna Disney Cal Arts Theater. Now, just a couple of weeks ago on the show, I actually had someone on to talk all about Cal Arts, which of course is the school that Walt Disney started to train his artists and all other artists.
Yep.
And there's an association with Cal Arts and the Walt Disney Concert Hall because Red Cat is in the same building, correct?
Yes. So when the fundraising began again in earnest, and when the three people that started it up again sort of got busy, they went back to many Disneys. One of which was the Disney Corporation. And Andrea Vandekamp, who was chairman of our board, was on the corporate board of Disney. And she said, you're going to get credit anyway. You might as well give some money to the project. Similarly, she went to Roy and said, the Walt side has given. And he gave an incredibly generous $5 million to the campaign to build Walt Disney Concert Hall for his uncle, with the understanding that he would also give $5 million to Cal Arts if the county would allow Cal Arts to build in the already existing garage of Walt Disney Concert Hall a downtown presence for Cal Arts. And we were able to, it wasn't me, the architects were able to figure out how to make it work within the garage, how to cut the hole in the garage and restructure it. And there is this jewel box of a theater that is flexible and spectacular that Cal Arts programs year round, actually. And yeah, it's Red Cap, the Roy and Edna Disney Cal Arts Theater. So it really is an amazing part of the Music Center's sort of overall offerings to have the students there, to have the things that you can only do in a theater that size, the incredible, sometimes avant-garde, sometimes a little experimental, beautiful work. There's also an art gallery as part of Red Cap that's open during the day. So it really counterbalances and fleshes out everything we do here. So it's a great relationship with Cal Arts. Thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah, listen, I'm a huge proponent of the arts. I studied theater at Emerson College in Boston. I'm a huge lover of live entertainment. These days, I shouldn't say these days. It feels like the arts are always kind of struggling to stay alive in certain cases. And I'm just kind of curious, how's the Music Center doing these days? And what can people listening do to help if maybe they don't live in LA but want to support the theater? Maybe getting to the theater isn't an option for them.
Well, getting to your local theater can be. There's theater everywhere, and theater can be defined broadly and in many ways. Create your own art. Keep art alive by doing what your passion is. Of course, I'm going to say support your local artists, be they performing artists or visual artists or any artist. I truly believe culture needs art to survive. The mission of the Music Center is to deepen the cultural life of every Angelino, and that's a big, broad task, and that's everything from the high art, go see an opera, go hear the symphony, to musical comedy. Hadestown is coming back to the Amundsen Theater, go see Hadestown, to also creating art yourself. We do incredible free and low cost programs on the plaza, mostly in the summer, but in LA, summer is 9 months long, where we do free dance parties and we do free concerts all year round. Gloria Molina Grand Park, which is part of the Music Center sort of across Grand Avenue, literally does yoga classes in the afternoon for people that work downtown. And we do Sunday sessions with DJs where you bring your family and listen to music. So engage in the arts. I would say the Music Center is also we're very fortunate that because our mission is broad and because we are with the County of Los Angeles, we're actually doing very well. The seasons are all opening strongly. Our resident companies are doing very well. Our programs are doing well. We're all about bringing art to people, not necessarily bringing people to art. You've got to meet people where they are and create art with people that they want to create. So there's room for all of it. So support an artist, create art, bang on the piano, dance like no one's watching. Just get out there and play, because we need art to survive.
I love that. It's kind of the perfect place to stop, but I'm going to ask one more question because I'm super curious. Talk about the logo for Music Center Group, because it's like this circle made up of lines. And is there any significance behind it? I've always been curious.
Wow, I love that question. So,
is it the pipes of the organ? Is that what
no? So, well, you mean the Music Center's traditional Starburst logo, the one we've had forever? Yeah. So, I have been with the Music Center for 37 years. So I'm the unofficial historian. I've been here forever. I've grown up here. I've been in my role for probably almost 20 years. And I love these sorts of stories and these sort of facts of worthless knowledge. When we renovated the Taper, 11, 12 years ago already, we took the building, the Mark Taper Forum, which is the smallest LORP regional theater. It's 720 seats, a thrust stage, very much 60s, a la, Mr. Guthrie and that whole period. When we stripped the theater down to renovate it, because it is domed and round, you saw the steel structure of the roof of the building. And folklore was, which I now believe to be true, that Mrs. Chandler was flying in a helicopter over the buildings, giving a tour to the press, talking to somebody, and looked down, and her designers were with her, and there was the shape of the roof of the Mark Taper Forum. And if you make that two-dimensional, that has basically been our logo since 1964. Now we've modernized it a bit. It has a little bit of movement to it. But my story, and I'm sticking to it, is that it represents the structural steel of the roof of one of our theaters.
That's awesome.
Aren't you sorry you asked?
No, that's honestly, I've been curious for such a long time because it's very like non-specific, and it feels like, well, this could mean anything, but knowing artists, I'm like, there has to be a meaning behind this. So thank you for clarifying that for me.
You're right. I thank you for asking. I love it.
Well, Howard, this has been a blast. I hope folks listening learned a ton. And when you're in or near Los Angeles, make sure you swing by, check out the Walt Disney Concert Hall and the other areas that are the other venues that are there. Catch a show or take a free tour, whatever you can do. And Howard, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeff. It was a lot of fun. I appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning into this episode. Don't miss any future episodes by subscribing and following Dizney with a Z, coast to coast on your favorite podcast app, where episodes are available 24/7. If you're a longtime listener of the show, thank you so much. And if you have the means, consider supporting the show over on Patreon. By joining Disney Coast to Coast's Patreon membership, you'll gain access to extra bonuses, including live stream Ask Me Anythings, unreleased episodes, and more bonus content. Take a look at all that's available by clicking the Patreon link in this episode's description, and thank you for considering. Until next time, anything you need can be found in this episode's description, from additional information and links discussed in this episode found in the show notes, to the DCTC hotline where you can leave a voicemail and be heard on a future episode, contact info to reach me, access to the show's official website, some free gifts from me to you, and so much more. So be sure to check out this episode's description. Other than that, folks, have a magical day. Bye!